Okay, good day, good morning, dear participants of the Indo-German Forum 2021. I warmly welcome you from the United Nations city of Bonn. In fact, if I can look out of the window right now, here from my office at the German Development Institute, I can see the UN campus and the UN Climate Change Secretariat right from my window. So a warm welcome to our audience and also to my distinguished panel for this session, which is the International Panel on Foresight 2050 for Climate Smart Cities. And as the far-cited title suggests, we seek to bring a long-term perspective to the overarching theme of cities and climate change that provides the overarching frame for this year's Indo-German Forum. It's a pleasure to be here. As I said, I'm Steffen Bauer from the German Development Institute, working primarily on climate governance and sustainable development. And I have the pleasure of being the moderator and chair for this session. Thank you also to the organizers for inviting me for that task. While discussing the future, obviously, will always be riddled with a number of uncertainties. It seems safe to assume that the decades that are leading us towards 2050 will see a continued trend of dynamic urbanization. And if we, as a group, were to meet again in 2050, roughly 2/3 of the global human population are expected to live in cities. Also, with a view to climate change, the laws of physics tell us that average global temperatures will continue to increase, even if, as a thought experiment, even if we entertain the utopian notion that we could just switch off global greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, due to the laws of physics, temperatures would keep increasing on the average global and drive global warming further. So what we know for a fact at the same time, without needing to engage in predictions, what we know for a fact is that today more than half of the global population are already living in cities, and that the world as a whole is urbanizing fast. We know that this global trend is driven especially in the African and Asian regions. We also know that even today, roughly 75%, that's 3/4, of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions originate from cities and urban settlements. At the same time, the energy demand of urban populations keeps rising, and at the same time, cities and indeed urban populations are disproportionately exposed to the impacts of global warming, of climate change that we can anticipate and must anticipate as global average temperatures increase. Those impacts include heat stress, especially in cities, impacts of flooding, flood events, natural disasters more generally. Water scarcity is expected to become a big issue, and a whole bunch of daunting issues more. And that understandably undermines the prospects for sustainable development in general, but also especially for sustainable urban development, and is a critical challenge. And because of all this, without wanting to be too gloomy here, it is a pressing question to ask: how will cities look like in the future if they are to be both climate friendly and climate resilient? What makes a climate smart city in 2050? And how do we get our cities to unfold that way in the 3 decades that lead up to 2050? These are the questions that we seek to discuss in this session. And thankfully, we have an international panel of a very distinguished expert to address these daunting questions for us. I don't dare putting so much pressure on my panelists as to say we will answer them all satisfactorily, but at least we can address them in a well-informed way and hopefully drive this important debate forward. With that, I'm very happy to introduce my panel. beginning with Anton Cartwright. He is a senior economist at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town in the Republic of South Africa. There he works on Africa's urban transition and also on the work of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, better known as the New Climate Economy. Maybe Anton, you can just quickly say hello so that everybody sees your face.
Fun and greetings to everyone from Cape Town and a very quiet campus at the moment. Good.
Excellent. Thank you, Anton. Our second panelist is Karthik Ganesan from India's renowned Council on Energy, Environment and Water, based in New Delhi, where also this virtual event is physically hosted, even though we are meeting virtually. So Council on Energy, Environment and Water is where Karthik is based. He knows the Indian energy sector inside out and also emphasizes air quality as a key policy issue that connects power supply, climate change and sustainable development. We look forward also to your contribution. And again, Karthik, would you just quickly say hello to show your face?
Everyone, this is Karthik here. If the session had been a month and a half ago, I would have looked outside my window, Dr. Bauer, and I wouldn't have seen much because of the pollution as well as the fog. But today is nice and sunny, so it's all good here. Thank you.
That's pleased to hear. So all hope is not lost. And as the third in line, I would welcome and greet Mark Ogge. He is the principal advisor on climate and energy at the Australia Institute in Canberra. And he brings profound expertise on coal and gas-based economies to the table, as well as on the impacts of climate change in that context. Mark, would you also say hello and show your face?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. I'm speaking from regional Victoria in Australia, where we get, we're experiencing the increases in extreme heat and fires. Not as bad as some places in the world, but certainly these issues are impacting us a lot, and it's really great to be part of this forum.
Thank you, Mark. And then finally, I very warmly welcome Katri Ketz from the European Commission's Directorate Directorate General for Climate Action, where Katri is a policy officer that focuses specifically on strategy development and economic assessment on behalf of the Directorate General, which obviously is based in Brussels, Belgium, the capital of Europe, if you will. Katri, the floor is yours briefly for now to also show yourself and say hello to our audience.
Hello, everybody. First, let me say that I'm very honored to be one of the panelists in such an important event that we have today. When I'm looking outside, I'm in Brussels, so greetings from Brussels. It's still quite early here. It's 9:30 in the morning. Quite gray. We don't have sun out yet, but I think it will get better and better during the day. So I'm looking forward discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Katri. So we already have a tour around the world, more or less completely, which is great. And what I will do now as your moderator, I will give a very brief glimpse on how I imagine the structure of this 1 hour session. And then we'll cut straight to the chase and get into the debate. We're essentially done now with the opening remarks and introduction of panelists. I will give us another 10 minutes to pose some overarching questions, and I have pleaded with each of our panelists to give very short answers, but from their various regional perspectives, from their diverse regional backgrounds. Then there will be one round of follow-up questions where I allow our panelists to dig a bit deeper on their respective backgrounds, and then we will have at least 20-25 minutes for opening up for questions from the audience, which then can be and will be addressed by the panel as we see fit, before we wrap up at 2 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And so without further ado, I would really like to dive into that. As I have already sort of suggested, climate change is of course a global challenge. We also know that the atmosphere does not distinguish between north and south. Urbanization, all the same, is a global trend, yet with regionally different dynamics, and also considerable variation at local levels, as each of you in their respective cities and municipalities will observe. So, this local level variations also include how cities are exposed to climate variability, to climate change, and how they are positioned to deal with those challenges. So the first round of questions that I would like to fire at our distinguished panel is, how do you anticipate the interlinkages between urbanization and climate change to play out in your specific regional context in Africa, India, Australia, and Europe? Then in 2050, how do you expect cities in your region to cope with the impacts of climate change, those impacts that are no longer avoidable, even if mitigation efforts were to be most successful? And then how do you expect these cities to develop in the decades that lead us to 2050 to contribute to preventing a climate change that will be unmanageable or would be unmanageable for humanity? I would suggest that you address this question in the reverse order. So we start with Katrin, and please, a maximum of 2 minutes per speaker. So Katrin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I try to stay in the limit, quite a lot of questions, but important ones. When we start with Europe and explaining the situation here, I would first maybe like to highlight or stress that our residents in our cities, they are luckily quite not quite well, but very well aware of all the negative impacts of climate change that's happening here in Europe, but worldwide. And cities here play definitely a crucial role in effective climate action. In EU, we have more than 70% of citizens that are living in city areas, urban areas, and urban areas are responsible for most of the emissions and air pollution. But we also know, as you stressed as well, that cities consume a lot of energy, around 2/3 of the world's energy in total. So it's clear that they have very big and important role to play in this process. But we also see cities as pioneers in terms of innovation, in terms of climate ambition, in terms of resilience and sustainable development. So cities are indeed, they are in the forefront of climate action, building net zero energy building, for example, local renewables, and so on. So there is absolutely a very strong and very direct link between what is happening in our cities, here in EU or worldwide, and the global efforts to stop climate change. So therefore, the transformation is especially clear in urbanized areas. Now, a few words also about the coping question in terms of 2050 to prevent the climate damage and how cities can cope. So I would just would bring one important element into this discussion. As I see it, so the cities need to adapt to the climate change impacts. It's clear that we need to put all efforts to what we can to make cities climate resilient in 2050, in 2040, in 2060. Because the climate change is getting, the extreme events are getting stronger and stronger each year. And in terms of climate adaptation, I would like to say that just recently, European Commission in February, for example, published a new EU's climate adaptation strategy, which increases the EU's ambition on adaptation, and it also sets out a path how to become climate neutral by 2050, but also to help most vulnerable in our society. So in recent years, as you said as well, we have seen an increase in extreme weather events that affects our cities, regions all over the world. So therefore, we need to work to build a climate resilient society and climate resilient cities. And we need to do that by improving the knowledge of climate impacts and improving the knowledge of adaptation solutions, but also by stepping up adaptation planning, for example, climate risk assessments, and by helping to strengthen climate resilience globally. So
we can certainly get back to how to do that, bringing up the adaptation plan and the climate risk assessment as very key instruments to that end. In the second round, I'm sorry to interrupt at this stage, Katra, but in the interest of time, I have to keep a bit of a strict management here. So now I would like to invite Mark to give his response to that first set of questions. What makes a climate smart city in 2050 from your original background, Mark?
Look, when we look at Australia, the CSIRO in Australia, which is our leading scientific organisation, has thresholds, projected thresholds of days over 35 degrees and 40 degrees in Australia. And you can look it up for various decades under the various scenarios of greenhouse gas concentrations. And under RCP 8.5, which is the track we're on at the moment, for some places in Australia, particularly in the north, it's hard to imagine how cities can be effectively resilient and adapt. For instance, Darwin, which has enormous humidity, is expecting by the end of the century will have over 300 days a year over 35 degrees, and many of those days much hotter with enormous humidity as well. So it's hard to see how some of these cities will even be habitable at that stage. And it's worse, I imagine, in many Asian cities, including in India. So I think it's just, we just absolutely have to reduce emissions and slow climate change as much as we can. I think the thing that I can really speak to here is questions around Australia's contribution to climate change, because we have a small population, but we have a huge emissions footprint, particularly in terms of the coal and gas we export to the world, which isn't counted as under our domestic emissions. So politicians don't really, they can still say they're meeting the Paris target, but we're allowing vast amounts of coal and gas from Australia to be exported overseas and drive climate change, which is impacting the rest of the world. And hopefully in the second round, I'll have a bit of an opportunity to explain some of the issues around, how Australia can get off that path and the issues specific to fossil fuel intensive countries like Australia. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark, and that will certainly be an interesting issue to get back to in the second round, the crux of the biscuit, so to speak. And Karthik, I mean, in India we probably have the opposite, or not probably, we do have the opposite situation: a large population with a much smaller per capita carbon footprint, but rising trends and many other challenges for the growing cities. So what is your take, bringing on the Indian perspective, if you please?
Thank you, Stefan, for having me on this. It's a very different situation, as you rightly pointed out, even at the outset. Being a developing country constrained with resources, what we've consistently seen over the last few decades, where we've really observed this change, is that in the global south and specifically in India, what we've adjusted to significantly is the coping mechanism, right? Whether it is with climate change or whether it's with resource shortages across the board. Everybody was doing this countdown to day zero. I remember in Cape Town a couple of years ago, and I remember it caught on also in the city of Chennai 2 summers back. And I can tell you, in my lifetime, there have at least been 3 other occasions where we've done this countdown to day zero, and we've still lived and come out through it, right? But the challenge is that coping is not going to be able to sort of work for the entire population. Right now, maybe the natural resources we're endowed with might enable us to do it, but that may not be the case many years later, where rainfall patterns are much more infrequent. So what really most people have done when it comes to and if you look at urbanization in India, it's been in such a way that it's really been the existing urban centers that have developed. So which means they've attracted a lot of the resource utilization from other parts of the country and from nearby areas to those centers. So we need to really rethink the way we go about doing our urbanization even, right? If you ask a person perhaps from outside of India, what they know of Indian cities, they probably can talk about these big name cities that we have. But if you look at many of the smaller developments that actually have to happen, where perhaps we can rethink the way we are actually doing our development patterns. For instance, on water, right? A significant bit of energy use in many cities in India goes towards extraction of groundwater, right? And the fact is that groundwater has basically become the de facto solution for the energy needs of the population. Now, that is, of course, again, not sustainable in the events where we have erratic rainfall patterns and there is not enough replenishment of groundwater tables itself. Cities like Delhi, which rely a lot on ice melt and snow melt for their water supply, which probably then infiltrates the ground, are rapidly running out of resource. But there is no imminent sense that we are past that point of no return. So I think in the Indian context, I would just maybe now like to conclude very quickly that we are low on energy consumption, but there are vast inequities, right? The often quoted statistic in the Indian circles is Delhi households consume as much electricity as an average German household does, right? You can think about it. So which means that we're not really that low on energy consumption as a city. But at the same time, this also masks the significant disparity between different people. So in India, I think it's really a challenge of what will the really poor do in the event of significant climate risks. Because I think the rich, just like between the global north and India, we know that the global north will adapt better. In the case of India, we know that the rich will adapt better. But what about the hundreds of millions who are not able to? And what solutions for them? Because I don't think coping alone will get them across the line at the end of the century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karthik. And you raised a lot of issues already, interlinkages to other resource questions, and the issue of disparities and inequality, essentially, that I think will also apply in the African context, where per capita emissions are even lower compared to India, yet urbanization is also moving ahead at an almost breathtaking pace. Anton, what is your take here?
Let me confess that I was struggling to think on why an economist who works on African cities would be invited to the Indo-German panel on this issue. But the answer that I came up with for myself, and which I put to the audience, is actually twofold. And the clue is in the time frame, up until 2050. Because it's over this time that Africa will undergo its massive demographic transition driven by urbanization. And so I think it's, in one sense, fair to say that unless you address this challenge in African cities, right, unless you're able to harness the roughly 22 million people who are added to African cities every year, and bear in mind this is a big continent and a lot of diversity, so I'm generalizing in the extreme here, but unless you are able to harness this demographic trend in Africa, you may not succeed globally. Right? It's not so much, as you said, a challenge of decarbonisation as a challenge of low carbon development or even zero carbon development. Although I think there are some issues around how we account for the emissions from charcoal, which tend not to feature in the global literature. So that's the first thing. Unless you get this right in Africa, you may not succeed globally. The second, and I think quite compelling idea, is that this demographic transition affords opportunities to get it right, which may be good for Africa, but may also contribute quite significantly to the global effort. And so there's this idea, which I can circle back to later in the questions, that there might just be some sort of late mover advantage associated with the idea that we have to build and accommodate these people in African cities over the same time frame that we have to solve the climate and the resource issues. And that, I think, is a compelling idea, and exactly how you go about that is something we can talk about more in the later discussion. Thank you.
I will be very happy to do so, and with that, I might even suggest we dive straight into the second round of questions. Thank you for all your inputs. We're very moderately behind schedule, and I mean, why don't you take up on your last thought, Anton, on how harnessing the demographic trend can be turned into an opportunity, and how to align urban development with the imperatives of climate governance and sustainable development, while harnessing at the same time, if I understand your notion of opportunities correctly, harvesting the potential that cities bring as drivers of economic growth and socio-economic development for a growing population, including and in particular in Africa.
Thank you. So, I mean, obviously, what most people talk about when discussing this is infrastructure and services, how you provide the infrastructure and services, bearing in mind that Africa is urbanizing fast, late, but also at very low levels of per capita income. And so you don't necessarily have the balance sheets with which to plug and play the sort of World Bank, if I can call it that, model on infrastructure and services. So most people hone in on this infrastructure and services issue. But of course, if that was easy, it would be getting done at the moment, and that's not what we see. And so I'd like to draw attention to three things, perhaps. Not the only three things, but three systemic things which I think are important to this conversation. The first is the relationship between central governments and local governments. Because what a lot of people fail to appreciate is that many African countries actually have almost nothing by the way of local government. And in fact, they have sometimes an antagonistic relationship between the central government or the national government and the urban authorities. This antagonism is based on political anxiety around incubating opposition, which is very rational. But unless you resolve that, unless you resolve what we call the multi-level governance issue, I don't think we have any chance of achieving any of these outcomes, which we so desperately need and desire. Linked to that is the role of state-owned entities, something that I think is underdocumented in the literature, because mostly these state-owned entities operate somewhat as sort of fiefdoms and at best reporting into national government. They do not design their offerings around services backwards from the massive unmet need in urban centers. And I think that's something which can be quite easily reformed. And so state-owned entity or utility reform is central to this issue. And of course, that links into into industrialization and industrial policies, which are crucial, combining urban expansion with industrial policies and low carbon industrial policies, which remain the flagship sort of policies in most African countries still, unless we get this right, a new form of industrialization, which is supported by SOEs. Again, I don't think we'll make any traction on this issue. And my third point, so multi-level governance, state-owned entities, my third point relates to new ways of what I think we somewhat lazily call informality or slum urbanism. Okay, this what we see, which is very often the predominant form of urbanism in African countries, is the rational outcome of the breakdown between national and local government and delays in titling land and providing the services that I've already talked about. So unless we can understand what we call informality as an intrinsic and integral part of urban development, unless we can find ways of improving people's livelihoods and prospects in resource efficient and low carbon ways in what we call informal settlements, and giving people greater degrees of tenure security and services, then for starters, I don't think we will arrest urban sprawl. And more importantly, I don't think we will be able to lift people out of poverty whilst meeting climate and resource targets at the same time. And I'll conclude with this final point, that in this context, the goal cannot be, for climate change reasons, it cannot be to decarbonize poverty, right? We have to use the decarbonization process to address poverty in African cities. We have to do that for climate reasons as well as humanitarian reasons. I don't think there's a climate compact that can hold that does not lift people out of poverty as part of the process. I'll leave it there.
I think that we will see a strong consensus emerging around that during our discussion. Thank you very much for three concise points that you raised. I can already see from the incoming participants' questions that the issue of informal settlements and their role in the equation will keep us busy in the open discussion. I also like to underscore your point on multi-level governance, which speaks to me as a political scientist, and which I think is also a key issue for consideration. And I would relay that with my next follow-up question for Karthik in the Indian context, where this may also matter hugely. In view of the dynamically growing cities and their energy demands, how do you think should Indian cities develop without undermining sustainable development at the local levels, but also with a view to the national levels and India's commitment to the objectives of the Paris Agreement?
Thank you, Stefan, for those questions. I think Anton hit the nail on the head with all the points that he's made. I couldn't, I think, put it better in the context of India itself. I think all the issues that he's brought up are pretty relevant. Perhaps the informalization is less severe an issue here in India than in Africa, but it is definitely one of the reasons why I think we have this massive disparity in the way urban India has grown. Speaking to your question about the energy needs itself, I mean, I'll take like after the advent of COVID, of course, the central government has been faced with severe resource crunches, and as a result, they've basically pulled back, for instance, the subsidy on cooking gas. Right today, India pays perhaps on a per capita, on a purchasing power parity basis, far higher than many other countries do for energy of all forms, and cooking gas is one of them as well. Which means that more than 50% of urban slums, right, are basically using solid fuels even today, right, for their cooking needs. Now, this has severe implications, of course, for the air quality within those households, and of course the ambient itself. And and the recent report launched by IQ Air just I think day before yesterday. I'm not sure whether air pollution is as much a sort of headline topper in the geographies where you reside in, but I think out of the top 20, I think 15 cities were in India or something like that, right? So it is a massive problem. And for instance, the government's sort of narrow decision to pull back the subsidy because they were not able to fund it given the other demands from the economy right now, for instance, the big vaccination drive, means that we've automatically now pushed this to the second rung of issues to be handled, even though just 3 years before, it was very pertinent program that the government started to actually convert everybody to sort of LPG use, right, away from firewood. which of course has a positive implication when it comes to fossil fuel use itself. But overall outcomes would have been very good for the economy in terms of reducing air pollution, because 30% of our ambient air pollution comes from household solid fuel use. So this, I think, is a phenomenal priority for India. And as Anton rightly said, I don't think India's really taken this decarbonization view to bringing people out of poverty. The LPG scheme was definitely one of them. But increasingly, in light of, I think, a lot of these net zero commitments coming fast and furious from many economies, India also seems to be getting cornered in that in that space, and with having to declare maybe what a net zero year might be. But it will definitely have sort of lasting consequences again for the poor. We'll refer to another. Given that Anton has covered a lot of the points in the African context which are valid, I'm going to use specific examples to illustrate it. So if you look at, for instance, the city of Delhi, right? A massive program to basically electrify private transport has just come through, right? Lots of subsidy support, but unfortunately, all of the early adopters and perhaps the people who are owning the four-wheelers for which the subsidy is really big are going to be richer households. Whereas Delhi has really not made the shift to really making public transport more easily available for a lot of the population. The metro rail here, which is one of the most fantastic systems in the world, is still priced out of many of their pockets. The bus system, which would otherwise actually have satisfied it, is not able to grow as fast as the need actually is growing. So even though the resources should be directed in driving public transport, right, going along with this global frenzy of decarbonizing transport and looking at taking away emissions as well as greenhouse gases from the transportation fleet, we've gone the electrification way. Now, one could argue, that's perhaps not the best route for India to pursue given the limited resources that we have, but that's something that we're seeing is catching the fancy of many an urban area in the city, urban area in the country. So I think India definitely needs to sort of tailor some of the solutions that might work for it. Do some things that cities across the world have already done for many years. For instance, the European cities, in having fantastic public transport, which then forms the basis for electrifying a much smaller fleet of private transport, which then caters to maybe needs that public transport cannot. So I think I would just leave it at this, right? Which is that I think when it comes to energy use, we still have to solve the inequity issue and sort of allow for that subsidy and for fossil fuel use to consume, because otherwise most people in urban areas will not be able to come out of their poverty. And in terms of targeting resources, I think India needs to sort of tailor its solutions, specifically in areas like transportation, where we may have to look for conventional but public transport solutions, as opposed to going down this EV way for making our cities more livable. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherick. That's a good tour a par force tour on the challenges facing India. Now, in Australia, it's of course a very different setting. Yet the challenges to transform urban energy systems are also quite daunting. And I would like to ask Mark, in knowing that the development, even the historic development, of many Australian cities and the Australian economy as a whole, is very closely, intricately linked to mining industries, to fossil energy systems. How do you envision that a just transition can be brought forward under these circumstances? And are there any key lessons that also may help other major fossil-based economies around the world that can be learned from the challenges that Australia is facing?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Can you hear? Yeah. Just in terms of cities, the good news in Australia is that traditionally we've cooked a lot with gas, which is mains gas, which is methane. But actually, we're in the fortunate position where everybody has electricity. Almost everybody has electricity in their households in Australia. But cooking with electricity with induction systems, which are now very cheap, is far cheaper than cooking with gas, for instance. And heating and hot water with efficient electrical systems, heat pump systems, is also, even when you take into account the cost of installing those systems, is far cheaper. And renewable energy is far cheaper than coal or gas power generation. So the good news is that the economics are working in favour of things, of decarbonisation, definitely in the Australian context. The idea in Australia, because as I was saying before, Australia is a huge emitter. We have a very high carbon footprint. We have a small population, about we have about 25 million people in Australia, but we produce around 500 million tonnes a year in domestic emissions. But in terms of our exports of coal and gas, when that's burnt, it will result in over 1 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions equivalent every year, which is enormous. We're only behind Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of fossil fuel exports, carbon from fossil fuel exports. Now, the government often justifies it as in terms of jobs and the economic contribution of fossil fuels, coal and gas in particular, to the Australian economy, but most of that is complete myth. So the reality is that we allow big global companies, global multinationals, to extract and export coal and gas from Australia. Most of them pay little, if any, tax, so they make very small contribution to the national economy through tax and royalties. They also provide very few jobs. The coal and gas industry are very small employers. The gas industry, for instance, which is very big in Australia, relative to other countries, employs 0.2% of the workforce. But the problem is that because they have very good PR, the public and politicians believe that their contribution is much higher. For instance, when we polled people, Australians thought that the oil and gas industry employed 40 times as many people as it actually does. And so those misperceptions about its economic contribution drive the justification for keeping going, which really only benefits those big global companies. And the idea of a just transition gets a lot of airplay in Australia, but it's a bit premature, because you don't need a just transition unless you're actually transitioning to clean energy. But in fact, Australia is massively expanding our fossil fuel infrastructure, and there's plans, in general, to pretty much double our fossil fuel exports over the coming decades. So that'll be 2 billion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is pretty frightening. So and that's supported by both major parties, really, and key union groups and key business groups. And so, the whole idea of a just transition when you're expanding is kind of ridiculous, and it serves as a bit of a smoke screen and distraction from the actual issue, is that we need to decarbonise. In terms of power plants closing down because the government actually subsidises coal and gas power stations in Australia and tries to obstruct the rollout of renewable energy. But despite that, the economics of renewable energy is so good that coal plants are closing down quicker than the government hopes. They're trying to prop them up, but these coal power stations are actually closing. It actually isn't a big issue because it's not that many people employed in them. I think overall it's about 10 or 12,000 in Australia, so we can easily afford, if we just reduce subsidies to the fossil fuel industry a little bit, we can easily afford to assist those people in terms of supporting them as they get other jobs and supporting those communities. So a lot of the justifications around the economics and the need to maintain coal and gas jobs is based on myths that sort of serve the industry. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So there are at least some rays of hope and some ideas and increasing ambition, even across parties, if I take it. Increasing ambition is also a good bridge to the European Union. I mean, Katra, in her first statement, already pointed us to the newly launched adaptation plan of the European Union. We also know that the European Union has tabled what is referred to as the European Green Deal, which entails a comprehensive systemic perspective and also a strong commitment to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So what does this all imply for urban development, not only within Europe, but also for European cooperation with its fastly urbanizing partners in Asia and Africa in particular? And in the interest of time, I will also already link this to one of the questions that have been posed by our audience, and in this case is directly addressed to Katre, and that is by Sanyam Bajai, who suggests that or basically is asking, what is the EU doing to keep communities in connection with research and policies, and how has the EU already started to connect for a greener world? Again, I need to ask you for a concise response, but still I'm putting it out there. Katre, please.
Thank you a lot. Yeah, those two questions are indeed very much linked. So regarding urban development and urban planning, we see Green Deal definitely as a driving force to empower city-level action in their transformation towards climate neutrality. But we have actually supported cities climate action already before the Green Deal for many years through various programs, funding mechanisms and initiatives in EU and globally, internationally. But I would like to say that more than 10 years ago, I think it was in 2008, we took a stronger approach and we set up a governance of mayors for climate and energy. Back then it was meant for EU and EU cities and urbanized areas, but also local communities. But today, this initiative has taken a very broad international scale with a global governance of mayors, which is now, I think, the world's largest climate initiative for cities, but also for urbanized areas, and it brings together more than 10,500 cities in I believe 140 countries around the world. So the governance of mayors will continue to be a central force also in EU's Green Deal. But for example, we are also expanding the International Urban Cooperation Program that have previously brought together cities in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas to work on sustainability and city-to-city and region-to-region cooperation to learn from each other and test whether and how ambitious climate action can be applied across the world, but also adapted to diverse local contexts. So all these city-level initiatives play a crucial role, and they bring many benefits, such as said before, reducing air pollution, water pollution, making our cities greener and smarter, and simply a better place to live. So I think that's this is our backbone of the framework where we are acting, the Green Deal. But also in terms of international negotiations, it's backbone for stronger NDC and under the Paris Agreement that EU submitted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. So it's all a big political framework that we are enforcing in all different levels as possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katre. I know these were like very challenging questions, and it's hard to really get to the point in the limited time. We do have some time left for the questions by our participants, and I noticed from the respective thread that several relate to the issue that also has been addressed already by Anton and by Karthik with regard to the relevance of informal settlements. Some are specifically to the Indian context, which is not surprising given that we are indeed here in the Indo-German Forum, hosted from within India. But maybe it's worthwhile to get back to. I mean, we're talking all these ideas about transforming cities as if everything was easily going by a master plan of urban development and cities development, when in reality we also have a lot of urban sprawl and fastly growing informal settlements. So I just pitch out 2 or 3 of these questions here. Now something is wrong with I can't scroll down, that's a shame. Anyway, one question by Frauke Kras is apparently an experience from working with informal settlements in India. Many people are using plastic waste as fuel. So that would affect air pollution as much as climate change. Whether there are information campaigns to raise people's awareness, I think Catherick will be in a good position to answer that. Then there was another question. Quickly respond to the issue of plastic waste as fuel, and the problems arising from that, while I try to figure out how to see again those other interesting questions that have been submitted.
I think I'll just maybe slightly expand the question from beyond just the use of plastic waste itself. If you look at it, urban waste management is perhaps one of the biggest challenges staring Indian cities, because what's actually happened is that we do not have a formal process of managing much of our waste. And unscientific and unsanitary landfills have been the solution thus far. But really, at the pace at which the generation is growing today, we've got millions of tons of basically waste that are piling up in mountains across basically the major cities of the country, which is a big problem. And you believe it or not, the city governments probably spend as much as $15 per family per year in just transporting waste from where they're generated to these landfills, right? Not in managing it or in scientifically assessing it, but in just transporting it. $15 per family per year, right? And you can get a sense of then how many millions of dollars are basically being spent in this. Now, our inability to basically drive home the social acceptance of, for instance, solutions like waste segregation are primarily a problem here, right? And unfortunately, this is where again the rich-poor divide shows up, because the way we see it, at least, I know I'm going to be ranting right now, but it again comes back to having a population that will basically clear up your mess is the biggest problem for India. And the wage inequality basically supports that as well. So the urban rich aren't, incentivized enough to basically do what the government needs to ensure that we are optimally utilizing the resources for waste management itself. And unless and until we do it, and until energy sources from clean energy, like whether it's LPG or whether it's electricity for heating, become more affordable, people will resort to what is available to them. And unfortunately, that is the waste that is lying around. So we have to really address the waste segregation at source and the resources that are being allocated to waste management in such a way that it doesn't just go to waste transportation, but actually it's sanitary handling and recovering the energy that's actually embedded within it.
Thank you very much, Catherick. Anton, is there anything you would quickly like to add with regard to that adds to what you have already said on informal settlements and the challenges there? And then I would get one more question into our remaining time budget. Oh, Anton has a glitch, he just advises. So I apologize on his behalf that he can't respond right now. Well, in that case, I will switch to the next question that I have. And we covered already a lot of ground in the brief time. Now, Mahmoud Khwaja also makes an important point that links to the issue of urban transport, which is also obviously relevant in the context of climate and cities. So he or she points to the rapid and enormous increase in the number of privately owned cars, 400% within 10 years in one Asian country. So he asks what may motivate the private car owners not to go for it, despite the affordability and easy accessibility and even government incentives. So how do we deal with that? And for good measure, I put on another generic question by Sanyam Bajai on the importance of environmental education, especially for kids at an early age. Maybe that links also to the challenges of urban transport and education in that respect. So I would invite each and every one of you to have very quick concluding statements, or rather, what is your take-home message for our audience on dealing with cities growth and climate change?
I'll just link it to the question on transportation that has been posed here by Mahmood. So I think the issue of aspirations is definitely something that needs to be sort of tackled at the core of it. An assessment done throughout, Indian cities basically suggests that 55% of the population aspires to own a private vehicle in the years ahead. I'm talking about a car. Now, whereas the ownership rate today is less than 10%. Which clearly means that there is significant room to actually expand this big ownership rate. And you cannot blame them because, that's what's been sold as that, that desirable position, whether it's social hierarchy or whether otherwise. So we need to basically change that narrative and say what becomes actually more desirable as a society. And I think we need to, and I think I'll link that to the other question that's been posed about environmental education, really sort of combining this with what the implications of such large vehicle ownerships mean for a population like us. Because effectively what we're saying is, cities like, Oslo and Norway are translating to EVs today, but then they're soon declaring that, in 20 years from now, much of their central districts will actually be barred from any sort of motorized vehicles. So why should India basically, wait for this leapfrog through EVs when we know that the ideal solution is non-motorized transport, cycling and walking? Right? So ultimately, I think it comes down to that education and setting aspirations. And here we need to sort of leapfrog and go towards more sustainable models and not necessarily the development trajectory that's been taken by the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik, very much. And with due apologies to your fellow panelists and also to the participants' questions that I did not read out loud right now, I would think it's only fair to have like our Indian colleague having given the famous last word of this panel. I would not wrap up without pointing you to the opportunity that this discussion can be continued and taken forward at the fair component and the networking lounge that is also provided by this virtual Indo-German Forum. So while we have to wrap up here in less than a minute, as is popping up on my screen, you are very welcome to join the networking lounge and pose your questions there and continue this important debate. I thank you all very much also on behalf of the organizers for your interest and your attention. I thank especially my panelists for their valuable insights and contributions. I apologize for this rushed mode, but I think we can take a lot away from it and hope to see many of you in the networking lounge in a little while. So, and with that, I also wish you a good and enjoyable and expedient rest of this year's Indo-German Forum. Stay healthy wherever you are and keep up the course for sustainable development around the globe, wherever you are, whatever you do. Have a great day. All the best. Bye-bye.